Dr. Wright has been working on a research project with us last year and this year, studying bud health. So he's going to give a project update today on that work that's happening. So welcome, Harrison.
All right, thank you. I'll get right into it here. I have a lot of slides. So today I'm going to be talking about, I'm Dr. Harrison Wright. I'm going to be talking about the small drought impact on wild blueberry sprout fields in Nova Scotia project. This is an update. We're still working on some of the numbers and stuff. My name is Harrison Wright. There's a bunch of names up there. I'd like to give a special mention to Kat Benedict. She's really the impetus behind this. Her love of wild blueberries is infectious, and she got us into doing this. A bunch of other people from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and I also want to mention Hugh Liu. There's not too many people in the province I can talk in terms of detail on bud morphology about. So, and also he helped with some of, or Prenia and Hugh helped with some of the gathering of the weather data that we collected. I also brought these up. These are some sprouts. If you want to see them afterwards, these came from an exceptional drought area, and so far they're looking good. But if you want to be cheered up, I'll have these afterwards. By looking at them, there is fruit on them, so that's a good sign. I'll just put them down for a second. So I'm going to get right into it. First, I want to talk a little about putting this drought in perspective. We knew it was dry, but exactly how dry was it? So this first plot I'm going to show you here. This is the top 10. First, I'm going to talk about not drought and precipitation. I'm going to talk about temperature. So this is a ranking, and this data comes from the Kempfel Research Center. We have a really nice historical weather data set there. And this is the top 10 warmest growing seasons, so April 1st to October 31st on record. We have 12 years on that record. So if you think about 2026 or 2025 in terms of one of the warmest years, it actually ranked 6th out of 112 years last year. And it felt warm last year, although if you thought it didn't seem that warm last year, it doesn't seem that remarkable. The drought was remarkable, but in terms of temperature, it was warm, but maybe didn't think it was that warm. It's because it actually wasn't that unusual recently. A lot of the recent years have been exceptionally warm. If you actually look at the last 5 years and you look at this top 10 list, we're consistently setting new records in terms of temperature. So 2021 is number 3, 2022 there is number 2, 2023 there, 2024 is there, and 2025. Last 5 years, they're all there in the top 10 warmest summer or growing seasons on record. And if you keep looking at those numbers and look at that top 10 list, you can see actually every year that has a record temperature, a record average temperature, they all occurred in the 21st century, with the exception of number 1, and we were only 1 year off. That was 1999, our warmest growing season on record. So indisputable truth that it's getting warmer, and we see that here. Okay, talk a little bit about the water. So we knew it was dry. This is a bar plot of every month. Those gray bars are the 25-year monthly precipitation averages. Again, this is Kempfel data, but it's a pretty good proxy for all of Nova Scotia. You can see we get most of our precipitation in late fall, winter. October, November, December, January. That's our wettest months on average, 25 years. If you look at those black triangles and the black lines, that was precipitation in 2025. So if you zoom out for a second, Maritimes, Nova Scotia, we're not known for being dry historically. 25-year mean precipitation values are well over a meter, 1,174 millimeters. I mean, that's a considerable amount of water. Even if you look at last year, I mean, it was on the drier side, but we were still approaching a meter of water. That's 833 millimeters. That was an issue. There's a lot of very productive horticultural regions in the world that get by with far less water than 833 millimeters, even in Canada. That's above average for a lot of places. The issue was the timing of the drought. We really only have 4 nice growing months in Nova Scotia. And they're right here, June, July, August, September. That's when 90+% of plant growth and development occurs, is in those 4 months. It just so happened last year that those driest months perfectly centered on that drought. So you can see the precipitations in those years. So I'll just talk about summer precipitation. The 25-year average for precipitation in Nova Scotia is 300 millimeters. That's June 21st to September 21st. That's that's a foot of rain. That's what we usually get on average. In 2025 in Kemptville, varied by the province, and I'll get to that in a second. We only got 68 millimeters of rain. That was the driest summer on record as well. So that precipitation level was down 77%. And so next thing you might think is like, well, how does that compare to other? We've had other dry years, but we've never had one that dry. So in 1998, we had a pretty dry year. There's some research around this time on drought and wild blueberries. So we had 155 millimeters. In 2000, we had 156 millimeters. 2001 is probably the next closest dry year we had on record and recent memory, recent being last few decades, as 127 millimeters. But of course, that's still a far cry from 2025, where we had 68 millimeters. That's nearly half the next closest year. So as I said, drought wasn't. Is that going off? No, I was just seeing if I could see it, the whole thing on the screen. I guess you can't. I can't see it here, but the dryness was a little bit. It wasn't across the board, but everywhere was dry. So this is Environment Canada. You can look at this up yourself. Environment and Climate Change Canada. They put out a drought monitor every year across Canada showing the dryness levels. So this is a map of what the conditions were like in Nova Scotia in September 30th. And this is about the time that we started talking about, well, what's this doing to next year's wild blueberry crop? We still haven't got rain. We started talking about that in August or July, actually. But this is, where it was getting pretty critical. So this is what the conditions were. And you look at this legend over here. You can see D0. There's actually 5 levels. The first one isn't drought. It's just being dry, but it's not a drought level. You can see everywhere in Nova Scotia was at some form of drought level at this point last year. There's none of that D0 abnormally dry stuff. The first one is D1. This is the type of drought you can expect about once every 5 years, and usually comes with some crop losses, but minimal. So you see a little bit of that, but there's very little blueberry production in those 2 regions where you see we're at D1. So D2 is severe drought. That's that burnt orange color. This is the type of drought you can expect about once every 10 years. It usually comes with moderate crop losses. We're not talking just wild blueberries. They talk about in terms of hay crop and woody perennials, including wild blueberries and stuff like that. Usually there's some damage at this level. You can see we have a little bit of that across Nova Scotia. And there is a little bit of wild blueberry production in these regions, including up in Cape Breton and on the southern tip of Nova Scotia. Less production down there now, I guess. And this was probably the most popular drought level in Nova Scotia last year. Most common, I shouldn't say popular. Most common drought level. This is about once every 20 years you can expect a drought like this. And that holds probably 75% I should say. This is the next drought level, which is D4, called exceptional drought. This is the type of drought you can expect in less than one every 50 years. And you can see there's some pretty prime wild blueberry real estate there, especially in Colchester County and around Parisboro and stuff like that. It's also affected the valley, which there isn't as much wild blueberry production, but it also affected down into Annapolis County, where there is wild blueberry production. So this was the state of things. Move forward a month, and at first I thought, well, we'll probably be able to get some nice contrast by going to different places in Nova Scotia. Some places had a little bit more water and some had less. They're all droughty, though. The situation changed the following months in October. We eventually got rain in late October, but for the first half of October, most of Nova Scotia still wasn't getting rain. And you can see at that point, I would estimate that 90% plus of the wild blueberry production was either in that extreme drought category or that exceptional drought category. So first, a little bit how we I even got to be doing this project. We got to be doing this project. So we first proposed a project here 2 years ago in 2024, 2025. We wanted to look at wild blueberry hardness. This is in the wake of the polar vortex. I talked about it last fall. And in the midst of doing that project, I wanted to know everything I could about wild blueberries and about the morphology of the buds. So we collected a lot of data at some sites. And it turned out this, we were able to use this as baseline data moving forward. So we thought, well, we're sitting on some nice data sets here. We can use that. So in terms of what we collected in that first project, which was 2 years ago, we looked at 2 high bush cultivar sites. They were located in the Annapolis Valley. We also looked at 3 low bush selections, which were in Kempful. And I know I said this last year, I'm not trying to push high bushes on anyone. I'm also not trying to push the selections on anyone. But when you're doing research, the nice thing about looking at these is, one, they're still vicinium. The low bush selections are still, they're selections from wild blueberry fields. So the nice thing was that we go to the exact same sites year over year. So there's no spatial difference or no, and also the genetics were the same in all the plants at these spots. So it provided a nice baseline data set. And we also went to 2 wild blueberry sites in 24, 25. This data set, I mean, it's more on target in terms of wild blueberries, but it's not as good. For one, we only had 2 sites, and 2, we couldn't visit those same sites the next year. We had to go to different sites, and also the genetics would be different depending on what field we were in, or even within a field, the genetics can be quite different across that field. So again, I'm using these other 2 as a proxy to learn more about wild blueberries, the high bush, and the Kempful selections. So just keep that in mind when we're looking at the data. There's a little asterisk next to the wild blueberry stuff because of all the other factors that are changing. So in that first project, we looked at things like fruit bud hardness. We looked at fruit bud number per sprout. We looked at fruit bud mass, weighing thousands of little tiny fruit buds that we plucked off. We looked at fruit bud fruitfulness, so the number of flower primordia per bud. And we looked at fruit bud water content. And we looked at fruit bud mortality. And finally, we also looked at blueberry wood nutrients and carbohydrates. This is something I don't think anyone in the industry is doing. It's kind of a new thing in other woody perennials as well, or a newer thing. But now some groups are developing data sets on the nutrient values of the wood and the reserves of the wood. So what we promised to do, after we were seeing this data set, we thought, well, we could use this to kind of find out give the industry some information on how the drought has affected the sprout fields in 2025 after the drought. So what we proposed is we said we'd go into a minimum of 8 commercial wild blueberry sites. We also said we'd try and spread these sites across the province. We were going to do our best to spread them across places that had different levels of rainfall as well. We go back to those Kempful selections and the high bush blueberries that we like to talk about. And so for this, we'd have some pretty good year-over-year data. And we promised to gather 100 sprouts at each of these sites in December. The plants should be fully dormant at that stage. And we look at a bunch of bud and morphology things, and also we would look at the wood nutrients and carbs. And we wouldn't try and find the exact bud hardiness level, and that takes a lot of work. And we're focused on the drought, but we would do a freeze, what we call a stress test. And we'd also do some fruit bud forcing trials. That's why I brought these up here today. So wild blueberry, so some of the extension results. So first of all, we had promised 8. This is a map of Nova Scotia, and I'll just point out where we were. So first, we were in those 2 high bush blueberry cultivars / sites. They're both in the Annapolis Valley. That was an exceptional drought area, the highest level of drought. We also were in that Kempful Research Station site where we have the Kempful selections. Again, these are just they're right there. They're also an exceptional drought area. These are just natural selections out of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia fields that were selected over a decade in the 1960s, and they were selected based on really high yield levels. They produce on average about twice the level of the average field on average, a wild blueberry field. So they're really been selected to they're a high octane kind of genetics. They put a lot of their energy into fruit production. And then we looked at commercial wild blueberry sites all across Nova Scotia. We promised 8. We actually ended up doing 13, and we went pretty well from tip to tip, right from the South Shore all the way up to Cape Breton, and then focused in the middle of where some of a lot of the wild blueberry fields are. And for good measure, we also went to a site, we actually got samples from a site in Quebec, which was dry. They had a dry year last year, but wasn't a full drought, didn't have the full effect of the drought that we felt out here. So first, fruit bud number per sprout. I know there's a lot of talk about how many buds are out there and when you can count the buds. It did seem like the buds initiated later than normal, in my opinion. I know looking at some of the high bush blueberry fields, usually you can see your fruit buds in November, and I could hardly see a bud in early November. But by the time I got there and went back in December, they were there. So it did seem like there was a delay. So again, we have our three categories: our two high bush blueberry sites, our three low bush Kentville selection sites. So there's the same site, same genetics year after year. And then we had our wild blueberry sites, which we went to two sites in 2024, and we went to three sites or 14 sites in 2025. But they had to be different sites, and of course the genetics were up in the air. So high bush blueberry buds, in 2024 we had 4.6 fruit buds per sprout. Those high performing Kentville selections, they had 5.9 in 2024, and the wild blueberry sites that we went to in 2024, just those two sites, we had 4.6. This is on the low side, in my opinion. It just happened to be the sites we were in and where we sampled. I will mention that Maine did a similar count last fall. I should mention that I think Hugh quoted some numbers earlier as well, where normally we expect these to be at about 6 or even higher. So looking at 2025, we look at the high bush blueberry fruit buds. We were spot on. We didn't see any difference in fruit buds over year. And this, I should mention, most high bush blueberry sites are irrigated, but this was a non-irrigated high bush blueberry site. So we didn't see a drop. Although it did seem to be delayed, we didn't see a drop in the fruit bud number. This was interesting. We saw a huge drop in the Kentville selection number. We went from 5.9 down to 3.9. Again, this could be possibly because of how these plants were selected. They're selected to have, really big crops, which means they have really big needs as well. They have really big nutrient needs, carbohydrate needs to feed that big crop. It was also interesting. This also taught us something about genetics, because we have three different distinct clones or different genetics at this site. Two of them went from 6 fruits per sprout down to 5, so just a moderate drop, 15-20%. One of them went from 6 down to 1.2. So again, the differences in genetics can make a big difference. It's not just the site. It's not just the amount of rain you got. The genetics played a significant role here too. In terms of wild blueberries, we didn't see a big difference. Again, I caution you to read too much in the fact that it actually shows a slight bump up in fruit buds because we're looking at different sites. But we averaged about 5.1, which is probably a little bit below average. I know Maine did a survey last year as well. We went to a lot of sites, like I said, 14 different sites. We averaged 5.1. Maine was averaging about 5.7. My guess is that number should probably be a little over 6, would be a more accurate number in a non-drought year, but it's hard to say. Okay, changing the metric a little bit, the exact same sites. Now we're talking about fruit bud mass. So we know the fruit buds are there, but how big are they? How fruitful are they? So again, looking at the exact same sites, year over year, the high bush blueberries last year, we were averaging large buds in high bush blueberries, of course, 18.3 milligrams. And those low bush selections last year, 9.8. So they also had a pretty big bud. They have lots of buds, and they also have big buds compared to wild blueberries. And the wild blueberries were 5.3. I do want to make a note. I know Hugh mentioned or quoted a number. I'd said 6 milligrams last year. In this assessment, I only included the 2024 numbers while they were fully dormant for these numbers. So that's like November through February. And the numbers I quoted last year, I also included April. And by the time you get to April, the buds have started to swell a little bit, so that brought the average up to 6. But for the dormant bud, it's actually closer to a little over 5. So in terms of 2025, after the drought, again, the highest blueberries, we see a decrease. The buds have definitely gotten smaller. Not a lot, but moderately, and down about 15%. Those Kentville selections, those buds really contracted. Again, these are the high performing ones, and they can only perform highly when they have the resources to do so. But we saw a big drop, 51% drop in those buds. In terms of the wild blueberries, it was more consistent with the high bush. Again, they don't yield quite as much as those selections, so the impact probably wasn't quite as big, and those buds have dropped a little over 10% at the sites we were at. If you haven't had enough of flower morphology or bud morphology, here's another way to look at it. This is flower primordial number in mortality levels. So this is dissecting the buds, actually looking at the flower primordial on the side. This is actually from 2024 not 2025, so don't worry. But again, we're actually counting flower primordia, looking inside the buds. This one has quite a few flower primordia. You can see there's 7, there's 5 live ones, and there's 2 dead ones. It's pretty easy to distinguish the two. I want to take a notice a second and mention that these numbers I'm quoting, this is how many you can actually see in one longitudinal cross area. We didn't take apart the entire bud and try and dig out every single bud. We just looked at what we could see in one cross-section area. Our goal was to get through thousands of buds, and we wanted numbers, and we favored that. So these are probably about 2 flower primordia off from what's actually in these buds, because we usually miss 1 or 2 when we cut it that way. So in 2024, the number of flower primordia you could view in one cross-sectional, longitudinal cross-section was pretty consistent across all different sites. The high bush blueberries was around 4, those low bush selections was around 4.2, and those wild blueberries were about 4.2 as well. So not a lot of difference. In 2025, though, at those same sites, we did see drops. So we know the buds are smaller, and they also contain less flower primordia, so less potential. But the drop wasn't huge, about 20%. For the high bush blueberries, a little over that for the Kenful selections, and for the wild blueberries, is about the same again. Everything is about down 20% in terms of those numbers in the buds. So this is, I want to say, a bit of good news. This is the flower primordia mortality levels. People are wondering, were all the buds all dead? Are they going to break? That kind of thing. So this is the control level. This is just 2025 data for the record. In 2024, we had very low flower primordia or flower mortality levels, at 0 degrees, and it was the same this year. For the high bush blueberries, those control plants, about 3% of them were dead. The flower primordia. Same with the low bush blueberry selections, about 3%, and those wild blueberries were 4. I don't think there's really any difference between any of those numbers. So 97% on average of those buds are still alive. So that's a bit of good news. So this is the stress test we did. We didn't try and determine the exact bud hardiness level, but we did give them a small stress test. So we imagined, what happens if they saw a -20 event for 8 hours with no snow cover? So we simulated that event, and that's a pretty extreme event. If you had snow cover, I know some places hit -25, -26. If you had any amount of snow cover, you're probably good. If you had even, a foot or something over those berries, they wouldn't have got to near that temperature. Also, 8 hours is a pretty long duration. Usually we have freezes, our temperature inversions, no wind, and maybe you get to that cold temperature for 2 or 3 hours, usually not 8 hours, although there's exceptions to that, like the polar vortex. Oh, I did want to mention that the mortality levels that they had in Maine, this is the data from Lily Calderwood out of Maine, and it was on about the same as us. It was about 3%. So when we had that small stress test, that mortality jumped up to about 10.5% for the high bush blueberries, 15% for the low bush blueberry Kenful selections, and 24% for the wild blueberries. In terms of how that compares, we couldn't make a direct comparison to last year because we sampled in December in 2025. In 2024, we sampled in November and January, so that's like a moving target. But I did compare them to the January ones, which should have been hardier than the December ones because they get hardier as the winter gets colder. And these numbers were actually comparable or even better than we had the year before. So this is evidence that we shouldn't have been worried about if the plants were vulnerable in terms of winter hardiness. Based on this data anyway, it looked like they were at least as hardy as they were the year before without a drought, if not even a little bit hardier. Why they would be hardier is an open question, but it could be because they were a little bit smaller, maybe a little bit less water content, but speculation. So now, talking about wood nutrients. I know I don't have too many more slides here. Wood nutrients. First, I'm going to talk about a couple other crops very briefly, only because we have some really nice data sets on how the drought impacted some other woody perennials, which wild blueberries is one of, a woody perennial. So just a quick note on what we expect to happen during a drought. How do plants take up nutrients? Well, I don't know if any of you have ever used like a siphon pump to fill a sprayer or something like that. That's what I used to use when I was younger, but you get the water evaporating from the leaves, and it causes tension in the vascular system of the plant, and then it pulls up the water, and the nutrients for the most part are dissolved in that water, and that a lot of nutrients that uptake is passive. So the issue is when there's not water, the plants have a defense mechanism against that. They close up those holes in the leaves. They're called the stomata. They're schematic. So when things are good, the plant keeps its stomata open. If it's in fear of its life and think it might be running out of water, it'll close those stomata, shut that off. That preserves the water the plant has, and it survives for another day. What it doesn't do is take up nutrients while it's doing this. So that's the catch. You have the water, you don't run out of the water, an important water resource, but you do sacrifice taking up nutrients the longer that you're shut down. And the plants were shut down last year for quite a bit of the summer, especially towards the end. Thought this was interesting. This is actually a scanning electron microscope picture of the stomata. That schematic I showed you wasn't too far off. This is a real picture. This is potato leaf, but the ones on wild blueberries look about the same. So another question is why wood analysis? And maybe you haven't heard of it. Like I said, it's kind of a growing trend to look at the wood of a plant. So what we do is we sample the dormant blueberry sprouts. Not an easy thing when your plants are only less than a foot tall and there's snow. So maybe it won't catch on. But anyway, we brought shovels. It's just another tool. It's an addition to soil, leaf, etc. So the theory is the wood, it's a stable, long-term, less ephemeral tissue than leaves. So, and it's, so leaf nutrition, that's a common thing, but leaf nutrition is a bit more dynamic, and it can be a bit twitchy in terms of the fact that, the sampling time can affect it. A decent rain can affect it. Even spray contamination, if you're using foliars, can really throw it off. So the wood analysis really tells a story at the end of the season. So the season's just passed, and it's the state the plant is left in. Not too much. It's not very dynamic at that stage, but it also tells you the readiness of that plant for the coming spring. And why is that important? Is because for the first 2 to 4 weeks of the growing season, and I think in Nova Scotia, and especially for wild blueberry, it's probably even longer than this, probably 5 or 6 weeks. That plant is highly dependent on its reserves. So the nutrients it took up last year and the carbohydrates it took up a year. It has to live off those for a number of weeks before the photoproduction or the photosynthesis can take hold and it can start living on its own again. So it's living off those reserves. It's like a bear coming out of hibernation or going into hibernation. So I'm very briefly, just because we have some really nice data sets and some of the other commodities and the wild blueberries, we have some good data, but it's not quite as robust. So we did a bunch of work on apples, and this is Honeycrisp. This is from 8 sites. And it just so happened we had some year-over-year data, and we also have reference data. So for apples, some of the analyses companies, they have databases, and they know what's the normal kind of amount of nutrients they should have and the total carbohydrates they should have. So a couple things jump out here. A couple things look normal, and a couple things look weird. Again, these are Honeycrisp apple trees, another woody perennial. So if you look at, so this is the year-over-year data in column 2, and this is the reference data in column 3. You can see a lot of red when you come to the macronutrients. So again, this is classic drought. This is what we talked about in terms of transpiration, nutrient uptake. If that's interrupted, then you're going to be hurting for some nutrients. And this is what we saw. So NPK is all down. This is classic drought symptoms. We did see this interesting thing. Calcium is way up. I think apple trees, they take up a lot of their calcium pretty early in the season. At that stage, every day was sunny. There were still reserves of water in the ground, so maybe it took up a lot of calcium, and then it didn't use it. And that's another point I want to make. So when you have a drought, you usually are limited in the amount of nutrients that you can take up. So you're limited in the uptake, but then there's also can be a lot of savings. Those savings come in the fact of not good savings, but savings for the plant in terms of maybe they're not growing as tall, maybe the fruit are being aborted, or they're not expanding the fruit. So there's losses and there's also savings. So that's why sometimes the nutrients can get really out of whack because of this push and pull that happens during droughts. Another really interesting thing, we only saw this in the apples, although to this extreme, but we saw it in every woody perennial to a certain extent, and that the carbohydrates, somewhat surprisingly, usually in a drought, you expect them to be down. They're actually excessive in the apple trees this year. I have seen some references to this. Most references suggest the carbohydrates should go down. Again, it might have had to do with the timing of the drought. It kind of just coincided with the start to the growing season. Everything got off to a good start. Lots of sunny days. There's still lots of water in the ground up until July sometime. And by that time, the reserves of water, we hadn't had any rain since early June, but there's still water in the ground, and then it starts to catch up with the lack of water. So grapevines, we have a really, really nice data set. We go into 20 sites every year at the exact same days on the exact same rows every year. So we had some really good data. Same as apples. Year-over-year data is here. Reference data is here. When you look at the macronutrients, again, classic drought, everything's down. The other thing we noticed, it wasn't to the extent that we saw in the apples, but the carbohydrates, even though a lot of those nutrients are down, the core carbohydrates were actually almost unchanged, only down 1%. That's a negligible amount. One more thing, because we also track bud hardiness at the same time, and this goes with our story about bud hardiness earlier, it didn't seem to be off in the wild blueberries, which is a good news thing. So we see all this red. Can it be that the bud hardiness was not off? We studied bud hardiness to death in in grapes, so I think I know the answer. One is this: nitrogen. It's not a good thing for bud hardiness. You don't want lots of nitrogen. You don't want to have a rapidly growing plant that's vegetative going into winter. The fact that it was down meant it was probably going into winter pretty slowly. And so you didn't have a lot of young, fast-growing tissue going into winter. So having low nitrogen is not bad for bud hardiness and woody perennials. Potassium is really important too. You could see it was down, but in Nova Scotia, we actually can't crop our plants super heavy. Cropping is the main sink for potassium. Potassium is one of the most important nutrients when it comes to bud hardiness. It acts as an antifreeze. So you can see it was down year over year, but you can see according to the reference value, it's one of the rare bits of green there. Potassium is still pretty decent. And finally, carbohydrates. That's another very important element when it comes to bud hardiness. And again, you can see our reference value. We were up in Nova Scotia in terms of carbohydrates. Year over year, we were only down a little bit. Again, it's probably due to the fact that we don't crop our plants, really, really heavily in Nova Scotia, mostly because we can't. The more heat you have, the more fruit buds they kind of set. So anyway, the ingredients were there. Despite a lot of red, the ingredients were there for an okay bud hardiness winter season. So finally, getting to blueberries. So exact same plot we showed before, all blueberries. That first one is high bush blueberries. The second one is low bush blueberries. The Kenful selections, and this third one is the wild blueberry selections. Again, I hope it's not as bad as it looks. I know it's a sea of red, but year over year, again, we see the same thing we saw in the other woody perennials. We see our macronutrients are off. Interestingly, if you look over that wild blueberry column, they're not off that much. But again, I wouldn't read too much into that because we're baselining it on only 2 sites, and they were not the same 2 sites that we went into in 2025. So again, I wouldn't read too much into that, but maybe a reason to be positive. This is one thing that I didn't see in the other 2 woody perennial crops. The calcium levels year over year seem to be down quite a bit. We didn't see that in others too. I'm not sure why that is. I'm not sure the implications of a sprout that's low in calcium going into the new year. I guess we'll find out, but hopefully it doesn't mean calcium's not very mobile. So although there is some, I'm hoping it doesn't influence things too much, but we'll see. Things like this, I guess, would be reasons for a slight concern. Some of the micronutrients, zinc is really important for early season growth. It appears to be down, except in those low blueberry selections, possibly because they lost so much fruit or fruit buds that they didn't have the need for it as much. So maybe because they didn't set nearly as much fruit that they have more nutrients. I'm not sure. And again, this boron as well. I guess that's usually, for flowering and for initial growth and stuff as well. That's important. Again, that's one good thing, or one of the good things. The total carbs, they're all down, but only by single digits, so minimally. So the carbohydrate reserves in these plants isn't too bad. Part of it could be concentration. The plants did not grow as much last year, so they did conserve more of some things because of that. This did not go as planned. We'd collected data from sprouts from 19 different sites. We had to store them because we collected them in December. We needed to chill them first, so we chilled them for 6 to 8 weeks. We went to force them. It looked very good to begin with. The buds, I swear, they started to swell. We put them at 20 degrees Celsius, and we put them on a day-night cycle, and with lights and not lights, and they started to swell within 24 hours. I didn't measure it, but believe me. And then 3 to 4 days, we saw early green tip. So it looked really good. But then they started to stall out. But don't get worried. We think there's an artifact of the storage. We're not experts in breaking wild blueberry sprouts, although we'd like to be. So this was after 14 days. So everything started really quick, and then it stalled out. but we think there was an artifact. We went out and recollected some sites, or one site, and we were recollecting other sites, and he was helped with that as well, and Kat. And so we did it again, and this is actually one of the example I brought up here. So this is another site that we collected a second time, so we didn't put them in storage this time, and results were much better. This is actually an exceptional drought site, so one of the driest sites, and we're seeing about 100% bud break, and they seem to be progressing normally now. This is after only 11 days, so that's looking pretty good. But we're going to keep, stay tuned. We're going to collect some more data and let you know what we find out. So conclusions. Bud morphology suggests a moderate drop, smaller, less fruitful beds. So that's not really good. That's negative. Bud hardiness levels do not appear to have been significantly compromised. So I'm optimistic we won't see a lot of winter kill out there. I know there's some cold sites. If they had the snow cover, though, they should be good. So that's a positive. Most nutrients reserves are down moderately. That's not so great. The carbohydrates, though, that's also very important. They're not really down that much. So that's a positive. Most sprouts, and fruit buds appear alive. So that was a big question to begin with. Are they all dead? No, most of them are alive. 97% of them are still alive. So bud forcing, we're optimistic, but we have to redo that trial. And everyone wants to know, well, is the crop going to be down or isn't it going to be down? That's the main thing, isn't it? So we know right now, if everything stayed the same, like we had a normal pollination year, it's probably just going to be down a little bit. Moderate levels. We see the buds are smaller. We see they're a little less fruitful, and there's some concerns about the nutrient reserves. But there's so much that's determined during these next steps as well. So early growth, pollination, fruit set, those are all still to come. If we had an excellent spring, it could make up for some of those losses. If we have a poor spring, it could exacerbate some of those moderate losses we've already seen. So not a definitive answer, but the best we can get based on, the unknowns that we still have to go through. So more analyses to come. Oh, yeah. And so a few acknowledgements. I know I've probably gone way over my time. I don't think I have time for questions, or maybe no one's, maybe. If we don't have time for questions, just Google my name or write me an email, or I'm going to be around for a little bit longer. But don't be afraid to reach out. We love talking about plant physiology and research. So yeah, that's it.